What is going on, AUHSD e-learning human geography students? This is Mr. Majewski. I am here for the second video lecture of the week, and this one is a big one. It's an important one. It's one that you need to know. We're talking about the all-important geographic topic today of diffusion. Right? Diffusion really just means the spread of something. When something diffuses, it spreads out from a source area. So as with everything in geography, right, they've got these secondary terms or these fancy names for these things, when really all they had to do was call it spread. Diffusion is a really important topic in geography, and the reason is because, remember, we're studying humans and human activity and human behavior. And so in order to better understand that, we need to know where things originated, and they originate wherever something originates. That's called the hearth. It's spelled like hearth, but it's pronounced hearth. And then as it moves outward from that source area, from that hearth, that's diffusion. And so when we're talking about the movement of people or ideas, we need to really understand what it is, diffusion, and the different types and the different ways that something spreads. So that's what we're covering today, diffusion. Before we begin, or I should say, let's get started, we have two main categories of diffusion. There is the expansion type of diffusion, and I will tell you right now there's a number of subcategories for that. And then there's relocation diffusion. That doesn't have any subcategories, that's just it by itself. All right, so let's get right into expansion diffusion. Fancy-dancy definition here for you. It's the spread of an innovation or an idea through a population in an area in such a way that the number of those influenced kind of grows continuously larger. So what we're talking about here is the expansion of an idea or a group outward from the source. It disseminates, it expands, it diffuses. Now this occurs with an idea, a trait, an innovation that spreads from one place to another. So the thing is the idea spreads, not the people who are practicing it. All right, so the people who started it remain in the same location. It's just the idea, all right, or the behavior or the characteristic that spreads outward from it. It expands outward. Now, there are different types of expansion diffusion, right? Because something can spread in a variety of different ways from the source area. We're going to start with hierarchical diffusion, which is one heck of a phrase. Hierarchical is the spread of an idea through an established structure, usually from people or areas of power down to the rest of society. So when something spreads first with famous people, or something spreads first with rich people, or people that are just connected politically, economically, socially, more than the rest of society, and then over a longer period of time, it kind of trickles down slowly to the rest of us, that's hierarchical diffusion. So we have a lot of different examples we can use. We'll start with technology. Look, most technology spreads hierarchically because, let's face it, most technology generally starts out being very expensive at first, and only the wealthier classes tend to be able to afford it at that time. So a great example for us is cell phones. We'll talk about iPhones in particular, but we could just say cell phones in general. They diffused hierarchically. They were originally located in very few places, or I should say very few people owned them. The original cell phones were like giant. They were oversized because the technology wasn't as advanced as it is today. It was kind of a status symbol if you had a car phone at that time in the 80s, and it was generally the wealthiest classes that did. Well, hey, the technology improved over time, right? The phones got smaller and they got cheaper as well. Suddenly, more in society are able to afford them, to the point today where, even in less developed areas of the world, cell phone ownership is very, very high. The price of the really cheap cell phones has gotten to the point where most folks are able to afford them. They're almost like an everyday reality for most of society today. Fashion is another great example of hierarchical diffusion. Look, almost every major fashion trend begins at one of the major fashion houses in the certain cities around the world, right? We're talking about New York City. We're talking about Paris. We're talking about places like Milan, Italy, and Rome as well. These are the fashion hubs, right? And most of the fashion houses tend to locate or cluster there. What we find is that they oftentimes set the trends when it comes to fashion, and then slowly those trends get spread throughout the rest of society. Oftentimes, the super high expensive designer dress is replaced by a more affordable variety, right? That's produced by companies like, Gap or H&M. And suddenly it becomes much more affordable, and you start to see those patterns, those trends spread to the rest of us. One of these trends I'm seeing lately, right, are these high-waisted mom jeans. I really wished those would never come back in society, but here they are. They go kind of with the fashionable crop tops. Look, it wasn't like some Joe Blow in a high school woke up one day and started rocking those. Chances are those were actually part of runway shows. They were broadcast by the media and by fashion magazines, and they've become more popular as a result of that with the rest of society too. Another great example of hierarchical is if something spreads from big cities to big cities first, and then slowly trickles down to medium and smaller sized cities over time. All right? Lots of good examples we could have for hierarchical diffusion, but let's move on to another type of expansion diffusion. This one's called contagious. Contagious diffusion is the spread of an idea, a trait, or a concept through a group of people or through an area where everybody has an equal chance of acquiring it or adopting it, regardless of your social class, regardless of your economic position or your power position or your political status. Everybody has the same likelihood of acquiring it. Now, obviously, with contagious diffusion, what's the most obvious example? Illness, sickness, right? Think about colds and flu. Who's most likely, if Mr. M is sick in a classroom, who's most likely to contract that disease first and foremost? Well, the people that are closest to me, right? So contagious oftentimes moves in an expansive way, slowly outward in all directions, and those who are closest to the hearth, to the source, are the ones that are generally affected by it first and foremost. If Mr. M, brought in a freaking skunk, alrighty, and the skunk sprayed me, right? Who are the people that are probably going to smell me first? The people that are closest to me, but eventually it's going to trickle out to everybody in the back of the room. And chances are maybe even folks that are outside of the room sooner or later. So contagious disease is always a good one. Some religion is spread contagiously. It tends to move outward in a relatively even pattern. Islam, throughout some of its existence, has spread contagiously. Today, it tends to spread contagiously in modern times in parts of Central Africa, for instance. Very popular fads, especially those that involve young people, and especially if they're inexpensive fads, tend to expand contagiously. Do you guys remember a few years back there was that really big popular trend with the silly bands, right? The little bands you all wore around your wrists and stuff like that. They kind of came, then they were gone, but for a period of time it seemed like everybody around the country, young people, were really affected by it and were wearing them or buying them or whatever. Fanny packs, when in the late 80s, early 90s, there was a fanny pack trend. It's come back a couple of times, I believe. But there was actually a trend throughout most of American society where fanny packs were super popular. That was a fashionably tragic time to be alive. Pokemon Go, if you guys remember Pokemon Go a few years ago, remember during that summer when Pokemon Go came out and everybody was playing it regardless of age, regardless of social class? I remember Mr. M was playing it, right? I remember I would take my dogs for a walk and I would get in battles at Pokemon gyms at my park with 80-year-old Hispanic Latino men next to a 7-year-old kid. So that's a really good example of contagious diffusion. It's one of the other things you notice a lot of time with contagious diffusion. Oftentimes, maybe those trends move faster. They may come and go. They may die out a little faster than some of these other types of diffusion. Facebook today, you know what I'm talking about? Most of you guys have abandoned Facebook, right? Because it was contagiously diffused. I think when your parents started joining and when your grandparents and your aunts and your uncles, you realized, oh my God, this thing has gotten contagious. This thing is where everybody's using it now, and so suddenly with you people, it became less cool. All right. I love this diagram. It shows the difference between contagious and hierarchical, right? Contagious diffusion, they both start in a source area, but contagious kind of spreads out in a more even pattern outward. Again, think of like a smell, like an orange that's crushed, and you're going to smell that orange scent, right? And everybody has an equal chance of acquiring it, but those that are usually closest have the greatest likelihood of doing so. Contrast that with hierarchical down here. Now there's our hearth, there's our source area. Hierarchical tends to jump over people or leapfrog certain groups. Instead, it goes to folks that are generally more connected, right? Let's face it, in some places when the internet was really getting popular, if you could afford it, right, you had access to trends and things like that before the rest of your society or your group may have. Then as time goes by, oftentimes these hierarchical trends slowly spread down and disseminate to everybody else. Okay, so again, I want to reemphasize, in both of these instances, we're talking about the idea spreading. We're not talking about people physically relocating and bringing those ideas with them. Our third category of expansion diffusion is called stimulus diffusion. Listen, it's when the basic principle or idea spreads, but when it gets to the new location, wherever it's moved into, it's slightly altered or modified from its original source, all right? So again, the idea is transferred, the concept, the behavior, but there's either some sort of barrier that has caused it to be changed from its original practice, or people in that area are engaging it in a slightly different way for some reason. So a really great example of stimulus diffusion is fast food, in particular McDonald's, all right? Because as we know, McDonald's is, well, seems like it's everywhere, and quite frankly, it is. One of the things that McDonald's does is when they locate in a new place, they bring that sign with them, they bring the business, they bring the logo, they bring the, the golden arches, but they will change the menu based on the particular tastes, behaviors, or taboos of a particular location. So for instance, McDonald's in India, Indians, especially, Hindus in India, which make up most of the population, they don't eat beef. They have taboos against that, religious reasons why they do not. And so McDonald's doesn't serve beef in their McDonald's restaurants in India. They serve veggie burgers, or they serve other culturally acceptable dishes. The idea of McDonald's and fast food spread to India, right? But what's actually served, the products that are on the menu, have been altered or changed in some way. Stimulus diffusion, all right? I'm going to post a number of videos from McDonald's around the world. You're going to look at those cartoons, goodness gracious. You're going to look at those commercials from McDonald's, and you're going to see what I mean. And then I'm going to have you do a quick discussion post afterwards about what you noticed with stimulus diffusion. So even though the link is right here, I'm going to hold off on playing that on the video, and I'm going to have you play that on your own as the next part of this assignment. Chinese food, Mexican food, other good examples, right? Think about it. From what I understand with Chinese food, the Chinese food dishes that are really popular in the United States and the West are not usually very commonly served in China. They're Americanized versions of them. Beef and broccoli is, from what I understand, a really good example. It's a dish you rarely, if ever, find in China, but obviously it's a staple in every Panda Express or American Chinese food restaurant that you go into. Mexican food as well. One of the things you people like to tell me all the time is like, this isn't real Mexican food, right? It's not authentic. It's Americanized. And so that may be the case, right? Where Mexican dishes that are more traditional are changed or altered in some way from how they were served in their original country. That is a really good example, fast food or just food in general for stimulus diffusion. Other good examples can be music. Oftentimes music is stimulously diffused. So jazz may diffuse around the world, but the styles of jazz and the practices or maybe the instruments used may change as well. All right. Reverse hierarchical diffusion. I probably should have just included this with hierarchical. It's the newest form of diffusion that geographers have identified. Remember how hierarchical said that people in power get the diffusion first, and then slowly it spreads down to the rest of us? Well, reverse is the exact opposite. It's when some argue that a diffusion exists that actually where trends start in rural or poor or less connected places, and then over time they become adopted in more connected places where authority or people in power or people with higher status are adopting them. Let me give you a few examples. Country bluegrass music, those were originally musical styles that were played on farms and in the bayou, and they were played with homemade instruments a lot of the time. And over time, they became more popular, and they spread into the north and into the western parts of the United States, to the point that we have country music stations located all over today. Obviously it has become very much more mainstream than it was originally, when it was just done to pass the time by folks that were living in rural areas who didn't have access to other musical styles of their own. Lacrosse is another great example. You may have seen the sport of lacrosse before. If not, right, there's some videos I may show you. It's a sport that's played by generally upper-class Americans. It's almost overwhelmingly white, and it's generally played on the eastern coast of the United States. Into Canada as well. Well, the irony of it is it started out as a Native American sport. And when Europeans arrived, they saw it being played and they adopted it, they established rules, and today we have professional lacrosse leagues that are out there. Rap and hip-hop is, interestingly enough, another example of reverse hierarchical. You could say it's hierarchical, too, because it started from city to city, New York, LA, Chicago, and then trickled down to smaller places. The reason why you could consider it to be reverse hierarchical is because rap and hip-hop was originally a form of urban poetry, and it was practiced by folks who were generally living in impoverished neighborhoods in inner cities, and it was a way for them to speak out and to voice out their frustration and the realities of life that they had. Over time, it turned into an actual, more, I don't want to call it legitimate, but a more established musical style, until the point where you started seeing, 12-year-old white kids in Omaha, Nebraska that were rocking Tupac or were rocking rap music and hip-hop, right? Today, think about it, we have rap and hip-hop bands all over the world. A lot of these bands are from areas where, obviously, they don't fit the origin story of where rap and hip-hop originated from, okay? Early Christianity was reverse hierarchical as well. Because if you remember, after the death of Jesus, it was a handful of apostles who really kept his ideas going, and who individually traveled around to small communities and converted folks on an individual level. Eventually, down the road, the Roman Emperor converted, and when that happened, right, all of the Roman Empire converted to Christianity. But up until that point, it was being spread through reverse hierarchical, generally poor apostles, travelers, wandering around spreading that message. Okay, so all of those we just talked about are expansion, diffusion. Let's go to the other major category, relocation. And this is a fancy freaking definition right here, right? Sequential diffusion process in which the items being diffused are transmitted by their carrier agents as they evacuate the old areas and relocate to new ones. Basically what they're saying is, when the idea doesn't necessarily spread, but the people that carry it do, that's relocation diffusion. And they bring that behavior with them to wherever they move to. Oftentimes, relocation diffusion is still only practiced by the folks in the original area and by folks who move to these new areas. They may be the only ones keeping the tradition alive, all right? So relocation is where the people relocate. Expansion is where the idea does. The people stay put for the most part. So when people migrate, not just people, by the way, right? We could talk about animals migrating, carrying certain things with them as well. And they take their attributes with them to the new place. So the Amish are a group in Pennsylvania, throughout the United States. They generally try to reject all forms of technology. They try to live more simplistic 17th and 18th styles with the horses and buggies, lack of machinery. They prefer to work by hand with hand tools. They were located in Germany and Holland in Europe. They relocate to the New World because they're being persecuted, and they establish their own communities isolated in parts of the United States as well. Little Saigon, Chinatown, Little Tokyo in Southern California, Those were areas where migrants from those locations, Vietnam, China, and Japan, all clustered in certain areas of Los Angeles. They bring their traditions, their food, their music, their religions, their customs with them. And they're very concentrated in one area. So the ideas didn't move so much as the people who practiced them did. All right, another great little image for you to look at here. Image A up at the top is relocation diffusion, right? The person moves. So here we have the people in their home location. Here we have folks that are already living in the new location, right, who do not practice that belief. Then the folks in the home location relocate, right, and they continue to practice those customs, even though many of the folks who were already there do not. They do not embrace it. All right, some might, but others do not. You compare that with expansion, where you remember the folks that are practicing the expansion diffusion, right, are staying put. It's the idea that spreads outward to new people who didn't practice it before. Now, migrant diffusion is a specific type of relocation. It's when innovations originate and spread strictly because of migration of people, even if the practice or behavior is no really longer exists back in the home location or the home country. So a few years back, we had something called the Asian flu in China, and it spreads to the United States because folks that are carrying it come here for to stay for periods of time, whether to live or to vacation for long periods. The epidemic actually died out in China, but by the time it reached the U.S., it was going strong, even though it was already wiped out in China. Another great example is bubonic plague, right? It originated in Asia, but it eventually disappeared there because people built up immunities. However, rodents were carrying fleas that had the bubonic plague. Those rodents jumped aboard ships that were transporting people and goods to Europe. Suddenly, the bubonic plague arrives in Europe, and it wipes out like half the population. Eventually, it spreads to the Americas, to North and South America as well. All right? Another great example, not involving people but animals, is rabies. A few years back, this was kind of a humorous story, I guess, unless you were like a raccoon. They were running out of raccoons in the Appalachians because people were hunting them. And so what happened was they relocated Florida raccoons there. The problem was these Florida raccoons were carrying rabies. And so suddenly what happened, we saw an uptick in the number of rabies cases in West Virginia and other locations in that area because of the relocated raccoons that were there. Let's take one look at one more here. Let's look at Walmart, all right? Because Walmart's a really interesting example of different types of diffusion depending on what period you're looking at. So Walmart started as an individual store in Bentonville, Arkansas. It's like literally, I've been there. It's like a Nowheresville, USA, all right? Eventually, it slowly surrounding communities so that by 1969, and by the way, this is an awesome isoline map. By 1969, it was located, the stores were located in this area, and then slowly outward again by 1974, and then 79, so on and so forth. So can you see that it's spreading contagiously outward, right? An even pattern. Everybody seems to have about an equal chance of acquiring it over time, almost like think of smoke from a fire as it spreads outward from the source area. By 1990, look at how far Walmart had gotten. It had reached Southern California and much of the rest of the United States. Here's the other argument you could make. Not only is it contagious, you could argue it's reverse hierarchical as well. Look, it started in poor, rural, southern towns, places where other stores wouldn't locate. And what Walmart did was that they promised to provide really, really cheap goods at the cheapest possible rates. Now, how did they do that? Well, they produce a lot of things in China and stuff at low cost, right? That's one whole nother issue. But the point was, it was something that was originally used generally by the poorer groups in society, by less connected rural Americans, right, who didn't have access to other buying options. And then over time, it spreads into Southern California, into the major cities along the East and West Coast, and became an urban phenomenon as well. Until the point now is, I live down the road in Brea from one, right? We have a number of them in Anaheim and surrounding communities in Orange County. Another great example of reverse hierarchical diffusion, NASCAR. NASCAR, also known as stock car racing, very, very popular in the South for a period of time in the 2000s. It was actually the fastest growing and most popular sport in one of the most popular sports in the United States. So, if you can believe it, NASCAR actually started out as just individual races between drivers. These were drivers during Prohibition. Remember when alcohol was banned in this country? And so we had what were called bootleggers, guys who illegally ran liquor and sold it under the table, right, to buyers. And so the original NASCAR drivers were actually bootleggers, and they would, for fun, race one another from small southern town to small southern town, and they would put money, they would put wagers on who could arrive there first. Well, the driving eventually became so good and kind of exciting and dangerous that folks started to come out and watch them on the roads in these small southern counties and communities. Eventually, they moved them to dirt tracks and then road tracks. More and more folks started coming out. They started paying for it. Eventually, it became a spectator sport. Major networks picked them up, and now here we are, professional NASCAR driving, where these guys are making tens of millions of dollars a year, these guys and ladies, and it's become big business with advertisements and corporate America as well. Soccer, a really interesting question. What is it? Well, if you look at this awesome choropleth map, right, you can see soccer originated on the East Coast in American cities. Why? Because migrants from Europe brought it with them. So originally it was brought by relocation, diffusion. Then it spread contagiously, as you can see, from 1910 to 1920 to 1930 to 1940. By 1970, it's popular in all these areas. At the same time, it pops up independently on the West Coast in major cities as well. So with soccer, you could argue that it was originally brought by relocation, but since 1900, it has spread more contagiously throughout the United States. All right? Example for us. Random thoughts on diffusion? Please check this out. This is an awesome slide for you to eyeball to give you a nice summary. Now, barriers. Well, there are barriers to diffusion. One is time. The farther you are from the source, the longer it takes. Time and distance. We call that time and distance decay. The further you are from a source, the less likely you are to be affected by it. All right? The more time it takes for something to get to you, the less likely you are to be as affected by it. The less likely it's going to be adopted by folks living in an area. Now, can I please make a big exception here? Throughout most of human history, this was absolutely true. Right? Things that started in Europe were much less likely to spread to the United States because of that little barrier of water we have in between called the freaking Atlantic Ocean. However, in modern times with technology, information moves literally at a fingertips click. And so time and distance decay are not nearly as significant barriers as they once were. With transportation like air travel, right, with automobiles and other things like that, and with internet and other technology, things move so much faster than they ever did before, so those barriers don't oftentimes apply as much. Other barriers, cultural barriers, maybe there are certain cultural customs that prevent things from being adopted. In Muslim countries, pork, for instance, is a taboo product for religious reasons, so obviously pork is not going to be consumed in those areas generally for cultural reasons. Alcohol in many parts of the world, and in even parts of the United States, alcohol is not allowed to be bought or sold or consumed certain times of the week. Contraception. Right? Think about this as well. There are certain religions that frown upon the use of contraception because they want people to have a lot of kids, a lot of potential believers. And so in Catholic communities, for instance, contraceptives tend to have barriers in place where they are less available and less widely used. Physical barriers, mountains, deserts, oceans, yep, they exist as well, although like I said before, not as much as once was the case. Distance decay is the idea that as something spreads, the further you are away from it, the less likely you are to be affected by it, right? Think of a rock rolling down the road. If I roll a rock down the road, eventually it gets to be too far away from me where the thing just dies, right, and doesn't move anymore. It's a lot like that with ideas as well, although, once again, let me reiterate, In modern society, distance decay isn't nearly as impactful as it once was. But let's look at a quick example. After the famous Hurricane Katrina in the early 2000s, many folks lost their homes, and so they had to relocate to other communities. If you look at this map here, this awesome dot map, what it is it's showing you where folks are relocated to. What you notice is Hurricane Katrina affected New Orleans, right? And where do most of the people who end up relocating end up moving to? The areas immediately around New Orleans. Then you'll notice that there are fewer and fewer people that move outward, right, the further you get away from New Orleans. And there's a lot of reasons for why people would want to stay, right? Probably family and jobs and things like that. But you will notice as well, in a lot of the larger cities around New Orleans, we see bigger concentrations than we do in smaller ones, okay? Acculturation is something I'm actually going to skip over right now. I'm going to save that for culture. I'm going to do the same with assimilation, and instead I want to get really quickly to the other topic really fast in this PowerPoint. It's called distribution. So not only do we want to measure the spread of something, we like to focus on how things are arranged across a given space, across a given piece of Earth. And that's known as its distribution. And so every place has a distribution. And how do we describe the distribution of a place? Well, through three ways. We describe its density, we describe its concentration, and we describe its pattern. Density literally means the amount of something within a given space. So you just count. And if you have two boxes that have circles inside of them, whichever one has more circles, the higher number, has a higher density. And whatever has the less number, the lower number, it has a lower density. It's as simple as that. So in my first period class, I have 41 students. In my second period class, third period, I have 40. So we're in the same room, the same space, and so that means my first period is just a little bit higher density than my third period. So that kind of gives you an idea. So let's take a look at the image down at the bottom of this slide. There are more homes and people in image A, as you can see, than there are homes and people in image B, right? A is downtown urban area, right? Whereas image B is a suburban rural area. So based on that, right, if we're counting the number of homes, right, or residences, A is much more dense. It has a much higher density than does B. Concentration just simply means not the number, but how close together or how spread out are they? If you look at an image and if you look at a place or two places that have the same land area, and one of them has a whole lot more things clustered together, concentrated, then it has a higher concentration, right? And if it's much more spread out in the second image, well, then that area is much more dispersed. So not only can we describe something based on density, we can also describe it based on its concentration. Let's use the exact two images again from the last slide. Since the residences in A are much more closer together, right? They're much more clustered, we can say that area A is much more concentrated than B, which it has much more spread out homes on larger pieces of property. Last one, pattern. Pattern is simple. It just indicates whether there's any noticeable geometric pattern detectable. It could be linear. You could see a line pattern. Circular, oval, square, rectangular, star-shaped, diamond-shaped, right? You might even just see something at a right angle. All of those are some sort of clearly defined geometric pattern. If there is one, you simply indicate the geometric shape that you detect. If there is no noticeable pattern, we simply refer to that phenomena as irregular. There is no logical pattern on which it is laid out, or no geometric pattern. Take a look at these images down at the bottom. A is a number of residences in a high-rise building. Each of them has a rectangular shape, right? And so we can say that we see a rectangular pattern with the residences in image A. Let's take a look at B there. That's an overhead view of a suburban development. Do you notice how the roads are a little curved, right? They're a little windy. There's no real noticeable geometric pattern. Kind of close in some instances to having a straight line. But notice those roads are a little curved. They're a little spread out. By the way, they do that intentionally because when you do that with the roads, you naturally create larger separation between pieces of property, and you can create some larger lots on which to build your homes as well. Okay, so again, when we're describing the distribution of a place, we describe it based on its density, its concentration, and its pattern. You need to be able to do all of those things, identify diffusion and types of distribution, because you're going to be doing a practice activity with that next, and then you're going to finish up with a quiz on this as well. Mr. M signing out. Diffusion, distribution, the 2 Ds, brought to you by the 2 M's, Mr. Majewski. Have a great remainder to your week, my human geographers.